The sun was shining brightly outside, and the airport was buzzing with noise. Flight 237 was ready for boarding, and people were walking through the jet bridge with their carry-on bags, chatting or looking at their phones. Inside the cockpit, Captain Morris was running through his usual pre-flight checks. He was a man who had been flying for over 20 years. He believed he could tell when something wasn't right just by looking. That day, something caught his attention before the plane even took off, as passengers settled into their seats. Morris glanced through the cockpit door and saw a young boy sitting alone near the window, halfway down the aisle. The boy looked about 12 or 13. He had dark skin, short hair, and a backpack that seemed a little too big for him. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't even looking around. He was just staring out of the window, his face calm but unreadable. Morris's mind started turning. Where were the boy's parents? Why was he alone? Why did he look so serious, almost as if he was hiding something? He had seen unaccompanied minors before, children who traveled alone, but usually they were excited, asking questions, or looking. A little nervous? This boy didn't show any of those signs. The flight attendant, busy helping passengers put their bags in the overhead bins, didn't seem concerned. She even smiled at the boy and gave him a cup of water. But Morris felt uneasy. He had heard too many stories in the news about suspicious passengers. He didn't want to take any risks. As the last passengers boarded, Morris kept glancing toward the boy. His quietness was bothering him. He thought maybe the boy had run away from home, or maybe he was being used to carry something dangerous. The captain knew it wasn't his job to investigate passengers. That was the job of security, but in his mind, he believed he was being careful, protecting everyone on board. When the cabin door was closed, Morris picked up his radio and made a discreet call to ground security. His voice was calm, but his words carried weight. He reported a possible unaccompanied minor who might be in distress and suggested that police should meet the plane when it landed. He didn't say exactly what made him suspicious. He just said it was a feeling. The flight began to taxi toward the runway, and passengers were getting comfortable. The boy didn't seem to notice the glances he was getting from the captain. He simply pulled out a small book from his backpack and started reading quietly. He had no idea that someone had already judged him and that his arrival in the next city would not be normal. Captain Morris told himself he was doing the right thing. Better to be safe than sorry, he thought. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice asked if he was really seeing danger, or just seeing a boy who didn't look like he belonged. As the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, the boy kept reading, unaware that this flight would change everything. Unaware that when he stepped off the plane, flashing lights, police officers, and questions would be waiting for him. And unaware that the man who set it all in motion would soon regret every decision he made that day. Jamal sat quietly in his seat as the plane leveled off in the sky. The hum of the engines was steady, and most passengers had settled into their routines, reading magazines, scrolling through phones, or adjusting their headphones. He kept his small, worn-out backpack on his lap, his hands gripping the straps, as if it carried something precious. It wasn't that he was nervous. He had been on a plane before, but not alone like this. This was the first time he was traveling without his dad or mom beside him. Still, he had promised his grandmother he would visit her in Washington, D.C., and he didn't break promises. The window beside him framed the bright blue sky and fluffy clouds below. Jamal watched them drift by, letting his mind wander. He thought about the stories his grandmother told him on the phone, about the big park near her house, about the old wooden swing in the backyard, and about how she was going to make his favorite sweet potato pie the moment he arrived. But as peaceful as his thoughts were, he could feel eyes on him. He didn't know it was the captain. He just noticed that a couple of passengers walking by seemed to glance at him longer than usual. He assumed maybe it was because he was alone. The flight attendant, a cheerful woman named Claire, stopped by. To check on him. "Would you like something to drink, sweetheart?" she asked. "Water's fine, thank you," Jamal said softly. She smiled warmly. "First time traveling alone?" He nodded. "Well, don't worry. You're in good hands. We'll make sure you get to your grandmother safe and sound." Her words eased him a little. He sipped his water and went back to the small book he had brought, a mystery novel his Dad had given him. The story was about a boy who solved cases in his neighborhood. And Jamal liked imagining himself as the clever hero who always found the truth. Up front, in the cockpit, Captain Morris was still thinking about him. He couldn't shake the feeling. In his mind, he was convinced that something was off. Maybe the boy was running away from something. Maybe there was an adult waiting at the other end with bad intentions. He didn't have evidence, just a gut feeling that kept whispering, "Something isn't right." He watched as Claire walked back toward the galley, laughing softly with another crew member. She didn't seem concerned at all. But Maurice had been in situations before where ignoring small signs led to big problems. He decided to trust his instincts. He sent another discreet message to the ground before they reached cruising altitude, making sure the police would be there when they landed. He didn't mention it to the crew. They didn't need to know yet. In his mind, it was better to act quietly and avoid alarming passengers. Jamal, completely unaware of all this, started feeling sleepy. The steady hum of the plane and the warmth of the sun through the window made his eyelids heavy. He rested his head against the side of the cabin, still holding his backpack close. Every now and then, the turbulence made the plane shake lightly, but it didn't bother him. He was used to bumps in the road, or in this case, bumps in the sky. As the hours passed, Morris kept glancing through the open cockpit door whenever he could. He noticed the boy never took out a phone, never got up to talk to anyone, and barely touched the snacks Claire had given him. These small details, which were perfectly normal for some people, only seemed to strengthen the pilot's suspicion. When the flight began its slow descent, Jamal woke up and pressed his face to the window. The land below was patchy with green parks and crowded neighborhoods. He smiled to himself, picturing his grandmother waving at him when he stepped out of the terminal. But in the front of the plane, Morris was already picturing something else. Police. Officers waiting at the gate, security teams ready, and the possibility that his gut feeling would be proven right. He felt certain he was doing the right thing. After all, a good pilot protected everyone on board, didn't he? The seatbelt sign came on, and passengers prepared for landing. Jamal straightened his shirt, slipped his book into his backpack, and tightened the straps. The excitement of seeing his grandmother was bubbling inside him. He had no idea that just minutes after the plane touched the ground, his life would be flipped upside down, and he had no idea that the man steering the plane believed he was steering the situation towards safety, when in truth, he was steering it straight into a storm neither of them could escape. The wheels of Flight 237 touched the ground with a smooth thump, and the engines roared as the plane slowed down along the runway. Jamal sat upright, a small smile forming on his face. He imagined walking into the arrivals hall, spotting his grandmother's bright red coat, and running straight into her arms. He thought that would be the best part of the day, but something strange was already happening outside. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Captain Morris's voice came over the intercom, cheerful and professional. "Welcome to Washington, D.C. Local time is 4:18 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We hope you enjoyed your flight." For most passengers, it was just a normal landing announcement. But Morris knew what was really waiting outside. Near the arrival gate, 3 uniformed police officers stood in a small group. They weren't there for regular security checks. They had been specifically called for this flight. Crackled quietly as they talked in low voices, scanning the passengers still inside the jet bridge. Behind them, an airport security officer in a navy jacket waited with a clipboard. Claire. The flight attendant didn't notice anything unusual when she began opening the overhead bins and helping passengers. Jamal stayed in his seat, patiently, waiting for his row to be called. He wasn't in a rush. He wanted to avoid the crowd and meet his grandmother calmly. When his row finally began to empty, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and stepped into the aisle. His sneakers squeaked slightly on the plane's floor. The moment he stepped through the open door into the jet bridge, he noticed the atmosphere was different. Cold, quiet. 2 police officers were standing right in the middle of the narrow walkway, blocking the path. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, looked directly at him. "Son, can you step over here for a moment?" the officer asked. Jamal froze. His heartbeat quickened. He looked around, wondering if they were talking to someone else. But no, there was no mistake. Their eyes were on him. "Yes, sir," Jamal said quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper. The officer gestured toward the side of the jet bridge where another officer waited. "We just need to ask you a few questions," he said. Passengers behind him slowed down, curious. A few craned their necks to see what was happening. Some pulled out their phones, sensing something unusual. The air felt heavier. Like everyone knew something was wrong, but no one was saying it out loud. I'm here to see my grandmother," Jamal tried to explain. "She's waiting for me." "We understand," the officer replied, his tone polite but firm. "Do you have identification? A boarding pass? Anything?" "Oh." Jamal fumbled in his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass, his hands shaking slightly. The officer took it, glanced at it, then exchanged a quick look with his partner. By now, a small crowd was forming in the terminal beyond the jet bridge. The curious passengers who had already left the plane were watching closely. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Another muttered, "Poor kid." Claire finally noticed the commotion and walked toward the officers. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" she asked. One officer looked at her but didn't answer the question directly. "We're just speaking with the passenger," he said. "Before?" Jamal could say more. A deep, commanding voice came from behind the police officers. "That passenger," the voice said firmly, "is my son." The crowd parted slightly, and a tall man in a perfectly pressed suit stepped forward. He carried himself with the calm authority of someone used to being in control. The silver badge clipped to his jacket caught the light bold letters read, "Federal Aviation Administration." Jamal's eyes widened. "Dad!" he called out, relief flooding his voice. Marcus Daniels, FAA Administrator, walked right up to the officers and placed a protective hand on Jamal's shoulder. "Would someone like to explain," he said slowly, his voice like steel, "why my 13-year-old is being stopped by police at the gate?" For a moment, no one spoke. The police officers glanced at each other. Somewhere behind them, Captain Morris had stepped off the plane and was watching from a short distance. Suddenly, looking much less confident than before, the silence stretched. Passengers kept recording. Phones captured every second, every expression. And in that charged moment, everyone could feel it's something serious was about to unfold. What Marcus didn't know yet was that this wasn't an airport security routine. This was the result of one man's judgment, one unshakable assumption, and one quiet phone call made mid-flight. And by the time the truth came out, there would be no turning back. Marcus Daniels' presence instantly changed the atmosphere. The police officers straightened, as if they had suddenly realized who they were dealing with. Passengers murmured in the background, some recognizing the FAA badge. Others just sensing that this was no ordinary parent. Marcus's eyes stayed fixed on the officer holding Jamal's boarding pass. His voice was calm, but every word was sharp. Enough to cut. "I'll ask again," he said. "Why is my 13-year-old son being detained the moment he steps off this plane?" The taller officer cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a report from the flight crew about a possibly distressed minor. We were told to meet the aircraft and ensure his safety." Marcus's brows lowered. A report from the flight crew. His voice dropped even lower, the kind of tone that demanded truth. Who exactly made this report? Before the officer could respond, there was movement in the crowd. Captain Morris stepped forward. His pilot's uniform looked crisp, his captain's stripes bright under the terminal lights. But the confidence he carried earlier was gone. "That would be me," Morris said, his voice stiff but not loud. "I contacted ground security mid-flight. The boy appeared, out of place. I thought it was better to be safe than sorry." Marcus turned to face him fully. For a moment, the terminal felt silent, as though every sound had been sucked out of the air, out of place. Marcus repeated, "Slowly, explain that to me, Captain. What exactly about my son appeared out of place to you?" Morris hesitated. He was traveling alone. He seemed quiet. Didn't interact with anyone, didn't have a phone. I was concerned for his welfare." Marcus let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "So let me make sure I understand. My son was polite, quiet, and minded his own business. You decided that was suspicious enough to call the police." The captain's mouth opened, then closed. "I was following my instincts," he said finally. "Instincts," Marcus repeated, the word heavy with meaning, or bias. A ripple went through the small crowd that had formed. People exchanged glances. Phones kept recording. The tension was so thick that even the officers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus stepped closer to the captain. But his tone remained controlled. "Do you know what I do for a living, Captain?" Reese swallowed. "FAA Administrator," he said. "That's right," Marcus replied. "I oversee airline safety and operations across the nation. I train and certify the very people who operate these flights. And I also review incidents like this when crew members make questionable calls that impact passengers. So believe me when I say this is going into the record." The captain's face tightened. He looked like he wanted to defend himself, but the weight of the situation and the presence of dozens of witnesses kept him still. Marcus turned to Jamal, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're all right, son. We're leaving." Then he faced the police officers. "Officers, thank you for your time. My son and I will be on our way now. If there's any further need to discuss this matter, I'll reach out to your chief directly." The taller officer nodded quickly and stepped aside. He seemed relieved to let them go. But Marcus wasn't done. Before walking away, he looked back at Captain Morris one last time. "I've been in aviation for over 2 decades, Captain. I know the difference between real danger and a child traveling quietly to see his grandmother. This wasn't safety. This was judgment based on something you didn't bother to understand. And that's dangerous." Without waiting for a response, Marcus guided Jamal through the terminal. The crowd parted for them, many people watching in silence, some shaking their heads, others whispering to their phones for their social media followers. The captain stayed behind, standing rigid in the terminal, but inside, a knot of dread was forming. He had expected to be praised for acting responsibly. Instead, he had just confronted a man who had the authority and the will to hold him accountable. And worse, dozens of videos were already spreading online, showing exactly how the scene had played out. Marcus and Jamal disappeared into the busy terminal crowd. But the echo of Marcus's words stayed behind, lingering in the air like turbulence after a storm. The next part of this flight story wasn't going to happen in the sky, was going to happen in offices, meetings, and maybe even headlines. And Captain Morris had no idea just how quickly it was about to spiral out of his control scene. By the time Marcus and Jamal left the terminal, the incident was already alive on the internet. Several passengers had posted short clips from their phones, and within an hour, hashtags like #flying-while-black and #FAA Administrator began trending. In the videos, Marcus's calm but cutting words to the captain were replayed over and over. Some clips showed Jamal standing frozen between the officers, clutching his backpack, his eyes darting nervously. Others caught the moment Marcus stepped forward, introducing himself and asking, "Why is my 13-year-old surrounded by police?" The internet didn't need much more to ignite. At the airport, Captain Morris tried to shake off the encounter. He headed to the crew lounge, hoping to blend in with the usual post-flight chatter, but whispers followed him. A flight attendant from another route glanced at him and muttered to a colleague, "That's the guy from the video." He could feel the air in the room shift, the way people avoided his eyes. Meanwhile, in a black government SUV leaving the airport, Marcus sat beside Jamal in the back seat. "You okay?" Marcus asked. Jamal nodded, but his voice was small. "Dad, did I do something wrong?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "You did nothing wrong, son. You were just yourself." This was about someone else's assumptions, not your actions. He wanted to say more, wanted to explain the ugliness of bias, how sometimes the world decided who you were before you even spoke, but for now, he let it rest. Jamal had already been through enough for one day. By that evening, Marcus's phone was buzzing nonstop. News outlets had picked up the story from social media, requesting interviews. Civil rights groups were tagging the airline in public statements demanding answers. The FAA's own press office reached out, asking for his account of the incident. Knowing it involved a high-level administrator, in the captain's hotel room across town, Morris sat staring at his phone. A short news clip was playing on repeat, his own face appearing briefly as Marcus spoke. The headline read, "Pilot calls police on black teen father, turns out to be FAA official." He scrolled through the comments, thousands of them. Unbelievable. This is what profiling looks like. How is this man still flying? Each one felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. He thought about deleting his social media accounts, but it was too late. His name was already out there. His inbox had 3 messages from airline management, all marked urgent. He didn't open them. He couldn't. Back in Washington, Marcus wasn't thinking about social media fame. He was thinking about accountability. In his home office, he sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing a detailed report to the FAA's internal compliance department. He listed the time of the incident, the captain's name, the officers involved, and the specific wording used in the complaint against his son. He attached screenshots of the videos circulating online, making it clear that this was not going to disappear quietly the next morning. The story had moved from social media to mainstream headlines. Major newspapers ran it on their websites. Morning TV shows played clips and invited aviation experts to weigh in. One reporter said, "When a passenger's appearance becomes the reason for police involvement, the airline has serious questions to answer." Another pointed out the irony. The man targeted was not just a passenger. He was one of the highest-ranking officials in U.S. aviation. The airline's PR department scrambled to contain the damage. They released a short statement. "We are aware of an incident involving a minor passenger on Flight 237. We are reviewing the circumstances and will cooperate fully with the FAA. We take all concerns regarding bias and passenger treatment very seriously." But it was too little, too late. Screenshots of the statement were met with skepticism and anger online. One viral comment read, "You're only taking it seriously because you got caught." In the crew lounge that afternoon, Morris sat alone at a corner table, his untouched coffee growing cold. A colleague approached cautiously. "You okay?" they asked. Morris looked up, his eyes heavy. "I was trying to protect the passengers, I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish. The colleague didn't reply. They just patted his shoulder once and walked away. What Morris didn't know was that Marcus's report was already making its way through FAA channels. An internal investigation was officially opened. Every step Morris took that day, every decision, was now under a microscope. And because the incident had gone public, the FAA's findings wouldn't just be filed away in a drawer. They would be scrutinized by the press, by advocacy groups, and by anyone who believed in holding people accountable. For Marcus, this wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure this never happened again to Jamal or to anyone else. But for Captain Morris, it was starting to feel like the turbulence had only just begun. The next few days felt like a storm for everyone involved. For Captain Morris, it started with a phone call he didn't want to answer. Airline's chief pilot asked him to come to the corporate office for a conversation. The voice on the other end was polite, but the tone told him this wasn't just a chat, it was a warning. He had been in aviation long enough to know that when a captain was called in after a public incident, it meant trouble. When he arrived, the conference room was already occupied by two senior managers, the airline's legal advisor and a human resources officer. A folder with his name on it sat in the middle of the table. Inside were printouts of screenshots, news headlines, and comments from passengers who had been on Flight 237. Captain, one manager began. "We're not here to judge you personally yet, but you've seen the media coverage. You know. The FAA is already looking into this. We need your full account of what happened and why you made the decision you did." Morris explained it the way he saw it, that Jamal was traveling alone, quiet, and showed behavior he considered unusual for a child passenger. He repeated that he acted to protect the boy, not to harm him. But as he spoke, he noticed how the others exchanged looks. It was clear they weren't convinced this would hold up against the FAA's scrutiny. While this meeting was happening, a very different conversation was unfolding in a federal building across town. Marcus Daniels sat at the head of a long table in an FAA conference room. Around him were compliance officers, legal staff, and public relations specialists. He wasn't there as a father today, he was there as the administrator of the FAA, the top authority in U.S. aviation oversight. One of his staff members projected a timeline of the incident on the wall, showing every moment from the captain's first radio call to the police escort at the gate. "Based on the data we've gathered," the compliance officer said, "there was no operational or safety reason for this intervention. This was a judgment call made solely on the captain's perception of the passenger." Another added, "Passenger statements indicate the boy was calm, polite, and cooperative throughout the flight. Several passengers have confirmed they saw no unusual behavior." Marcus listened without speaking for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was low but firm. "This is not just about one passenger," he said. "This is about whether we as an industry allow personal bias to shape operational decisions. If a child can be singled out and escorted off a plane by police without cause, then our system is failing." The FAA team discussed next steps, an official request for the airline's incident report, an interview with Captain Morris, and a review of crew training materials to see whether bias awareness was even part of their safety protocols. Marcus insisted on transparency, knowing that public trust in the FAA was just as important as holding the airline accountable. Back at the airline's headquarters, the legal advisor leaned forward and told Morris something that made his stomach sink. "Until the FAA investigation is concluded, you're grounded. This is non-punitive for now, but you're not to operate any flights. Also, you should prepare for a formal interview with FAA investigators." Morris nodded stiffly, but inside, panic was growing. Grounded meant lost pay. Grounded meant his name would circulate in ways no pilot wanted. And if the FAA report found fault in his actions, his career could be over. Meanwhile, Marcus received another call, this time from a major television network, inviting him for a prime-time interview. They wanted to talk about the dangers of racial profiling in air travel, and the fact that the victim in this case was the son of the FAA administrator made it headline gold. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want the focus to be on him as a public official. He wanted it to be on the larger issue. But he also knew that public pressure was often the only way to make airlines change. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with Jamal, Marcus explained what was happening. "They've grounded the pilot," he said. "They're going to review everything that happened. But this isn't just about him. Anymore, it's about fixing the system." Jamal was quiet for a moment. "Does that mean no other kid will have to go through what I did?" "That's the goal," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But it only works if we keep pushing." While Marcus spoke to his son, Captain Morris sat alone in his apartment. Staring at the framed photo of his first solo flight years ago, flying had been his dream since childhood. Now, for the first time, he wondered if it was slipping away, not because of a mistake with an aircraft, but because of a mistake in judgment. In the coming days, the FAA investigation would dig deeper. The media coverage would intensify, and both men Marcus and Maurice. It had been 2 weeks since the incident. But the story was still everywhere. News channels kept replaying the footage of Jamal standing between 2 police officers at the gate, clutching his backpack. Social media feeds were still flooded with hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack, #FAA Administrator, and #GroundThePilot. Activists had begun calling for nationwide reforms to stop racial profiling in the airline industry, and Marcus Daniels had quietly become the public face of that fight. Even though he never sought the spotlight, the FAA investigation was in full swing, but parts of it had already leaked to the press. One leak came from an anonymous source inside the agency who told a reporter, "So far, there's no evidence of any threat. The boy's behavior was normal for a young passenger. This looks like a case of poor judgment by the captain." That single statement made headlines. It wasn't an official conclusion, but to the public, it sounded like the verdict was already in. At airline headquarters, the pressure was suffocating. Executives held daily meetings with the PR team, legal advisors, and senior flight operations. Managers, their inboxes were flooded with angry emails from customers threatening to take their business to competitors. Civil rights organizations were asking for meetings with the airline CEO. Shareholders wanted reassurance that this wouldn't damage the brand. In one of those tense meetings, the CEO asked bluntly, "Can we defend this captain's decision in public?" The legal advisor shook her head. "Not without looking like we're defending profiling. And in this climate, that would be a disaster." Meanwhile, Captain Morris was living in a kind of limbo. Grounded and under investigation, he spent his days pacing his apartment, avoiding the news, and trying not to read the online comments. He told himself over and over that he had acted in good faith, that his intentions had been to protect the passengers, but deep down, he knew those words didn't erase what everyone else saw. Friends and colleagues started to distance themselves. Some sent polite texts, "Hang in there, man," but they stopped inviting him to social gatherings. A few avoided him entirely, afraid of being caught in the backlash. For the first time in his career, Morris felt like an outsider in the very industry he had devoted his life to. While his world was shrinking, Marcus's was getting busier. He was in back-to-back meetings with FAA officials and advocacy groups. He spoke carefully in every interview, never letting the discussion turn into a personal vendetta. "This isn't about one boy," Marcus told a national news anchor. "It's about the protocols we follow or fail to follow when making decisions about passengers. We cannot allow bias, conscious or unconscious, to dictate those decisions. The stakes are too high." The interview went viral. People praised Marcus for staying composed and focusing on systemic change instead of revenge. But the message was clear. The airline and its captain had mishandled the situation, and the FAA was watching closely. Then came the day when the fast preliminary findings were quietly shared with the airline. The document was marked confidential, but someone leaked a summary to a major newspaper. The headline the next morning read, "FAA report finds no justification for police. Intervention in Flight 237 incident." The article stated that Jamal had not violated any airline policies, posed no threat, and exhibited behavior well within the norms for a young passenger traveling alone. It also noted that the captain had not consulted with the cabin crew before making his call to the ground, something the FAA labeled a serious lapse in communication protocol. Public reaction was swift and fierce. Calls for the airline to discipline Captain Morris grew louder. Boycotts were organized online. Airline customer service lines were overwhelmed with complaints. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room watching the news. Jamal was curled up on the couch beside him, doing homework, trying to pretend none of this mattered. But Marcus knew it did. Every headline, every conversation, was a reminder of the moment in the terminal when his son's innocence had been treated like a crime. At the same time, in his small apartment, Morris stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, reading the leaked report in disbelief. Each line felt like a punch. The words "no justification" repeated in his head until they blurred together. He thought about the years he'd spent building his reputation, the trust he had earned as a captain, and how it might all be undone by one decision he could never take back. He knew now that the final FAA report was coming soon. And when it landed, it wouldn't just decide his career, it would decide how the public remembered him. The countdown to that moment had begun, and neither Marcus nor Morris could control where it would end. Asterisk, asterisk, it was thorough. 20 pages of interviews, timelines, and official conclusions. In clear, unemotional language, the report stated that there had been no operational, safety, or security justification for Captain Morris's decision to involve law enforcement. In Jamal's arrival, it went further, noting that the captain had failed to consult with the cabin crew before contacting ground security, violating established communication procedures. The final paragraph was blunt. This incident reflects a lapse in judgment that, if unaddressed, risks undermining public trust in airline operations and the impartiality of crew decision-making. The document was public, and within hours, news channels were dissecting it. Some commentators called it a wake-up call for the aviation industry. Others said it was long overdue. Civil rights organizations praised the FAA for not downplaying the role bias played in the decision. At the airline's headquarters, executives moved quickly. That afternoon, the CEO released a video statement. The backdrop was a spotless hangar with one of their jets parked behind him. His tone was solemn. "We apologize to Jamal Daniels and his family for the distress caused by this incident. We have initiated mandatory bias awareness and cultural sensitivity training for all flight crews. Captain Morris will be removed from active flight duty for the remainder of the year and will undergo retraining before any consideration for reinstatement." The apology played on every major news network, but for Marcus, it wasn't the words that mattered, it was whether the industry would change. Sitting in his office, he read emails from parents across the country, many of them sharing their own stories of being profiled while traveling. Some were angry, some were simply tired. All of them wanted to believe things could be different. That evening, Marcus went home and found Jamal in the backyard, shooting hoops. For a moment, he just watched his son, the same boy who had sat quietly on Flight 237, reading a mystery novel. Not knowing a storm was waiting for him at the gate, when Jamal noticed his dad, he passed him the ball. "So, is it over?" he asked. Marcus caught the ball, held it for a second, and then passed it back. "The investigation's over. But the work isn't. We've got changes to push through, and I'm going to make sure they happen." "Jamal, dribbled slowly. "I'm glad you were there, Dad. If it had been someone else's kid." He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood, in a quiet apartment across the city. Captain Morris watched the airline CEO's statement on his laptop. The words removed from active flight duty hit like a punch, but in truth, he had expected them. Still, hearing it out loud made it real. He turned off the video and sat in silence, staring at the framed photo of him in his early days as a pilot, smiling in front of a small propeller plane. He thought about the thousands of safe flights he had captained, the passengers he had delivered without a hitch, and how none of that mattered now. Regret was a heavy thing. It didn't come in a sudden rush. It settled in slowly, like an anchor sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And Morris knew it would stay with him, no matter what retraining he completed, no matter if he ever flew again. Weeks later, Marcus stood at a podium at an aviation safety conference. In the audience were pilots, airline executives, and regulators from across the country. He spoke not as the FAA administrator, but as a father. "My son's story is one of many," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "It is a reminder that safety is not just about engines, weather, or flight paths. Safety is also about the trust between crew and passengers. That trust can be broken in an instant when assumptions replace facts. We can do better. We must do better." The audience gave him a standing ovation, not because of his title, but because of the truth in his words. As for Jamal, life slowly returned to normal. He visited his grandmother, played basketball, and went back to school. But sometimes, when he passed an airport, he would glance at the planes in the sky and remember that day, not with fear, but with the knowledge that his story had helped change something bigger than himself. And somewhere, Captain Morris sat in the quiet, thinking about what he had learned the hard way. A single decision, made in seconds, can follow you for a lifetime. The skies above were still clear, but for the people who lived this story, the memory of Flight 237 would always remain. Reminder that true safety begins with seeing each passenger for who they are, not who we assume them to be.